hurt their conscience as such. So in the spirit of reconciliation, it's called Youth Day because it's a recognition of the youth that stood up against the injustices and continued the protest and the fight and so on against South Africa. So that's what happened. Soweto actually stands for Southwestern Townships. It's a mass of areas where black people lived, that were just dormitory towns. I don't know if you have that in the US, what we call dormitory towns, where there's no business, there's no factories, there's nothing. There's just homes, shacks, that were just very low-cost housing that was put up. And these were the people basically had to be transported to work. And they had to take trains, buses, and so on, and travel for hours to get to the mines, the factories, and everywhere else where they worked. So it was just, there's no resources, there's no entertainment, there's no parks, there's nothing. It's like take your dorms that you live in colleges and just expand that, 1,000-fold, 2,000-fold. That's the time of, that's what we call them, dormitory towns. So, you may ask, what happened to the 18-year-old who carried Hector Peterson? He's a hero, right? Unfortunately for him, his family were very close to the Mandelas. And Nelson Mandela was in prison, but Winnie Mandela was not. So, they visited and so on. So he was a known target of the South African police, just by virtue of the fact that he was, So because his picture was put into the paper, they harassed him, and they were trying to find him. Eventually, you have to, we learned very well at that time, there comes a point where you're going to get arrested, so you run away and you hide from the police. You kind of find ways to hide from the police. So he was hiding from the police and so on because they were looking for him, because they blamed him for this image, which they were right. I mean, he was in this image. But they said that is what caused the world to actually complain, because he had the audacity of trying to pick this kid up and run with him to the hospital or take him to some place of safety. That's the mentality that we have to deal with. So he eventually left South Africa, and his mother gave him 10 rands at the time, which was a fair amount of money, which is probably equivalent to less than $1 today. And he traveled to Botswana. He went into exile, which was a neighboring country, a very, very small country. And from there, he went to Nigeria. He got a scholarship from the United Nations to do some studying in Nigeria. Nigeria and Tanzania were two of the places where a lot of the youth went. And they went to join what we call MK, which was Mkhonto Sizwe, which was the army of the African National Congress. And that's where they were trained as fighters to come back to South Africa and in guerrilla warfare to fight. But he didn't do that. Well, we're not sure what he did, because right until today we don't know beyond that. The last time he wrote a letter to his mother was in 1979. And they don't know what happened. There was some reports that he may have gone into, he was in Canada in jail for 10 years for, I think, what's it called? Not being there with like an undocumented person. Mm-hmm. And he was being held by the Canadians because he had no papers. He had nothing to show his identity and so on. So the South African government obviously is trying to find him, but they haven't been successful to date.
They're still looking for it.
They're still trying to find him. There's, this may confuse you, but in South Africa, it's a strange thing that you have to live with, where parents who had children who were politically active, kind of, you obviously want to see them home that night, but somehow you knew there wasn't that guarantee that you're going to see your children that night come home from school or college or wherever they were. And sometimes they'll just disappear, and you'll hear about it that they managed to escape to bordering countries, to join MK, to be more involved in it. But also the South African government had a very, very good network of people who went around, mercenaries who went around killing people and burying them, and we had a number of people disappear, that the bodies could never be traced or found or anything like that. So there's millions of South Africans who just went missing, and were the casualties of war. So that's the story of Soweto, and that's the significance of Soweto Day or Youth Day, whichever one you prefer to call it, and that's the significance of the day to us as South Africans.
So would you explain when the Constitution, you talked about changing the name from Soweto Day to Youth Day in the spirit of reconciliation? Talk to me a little bit about that.
So in 1992, Nelson Mandela was released from prison after a long, protracted negotiation. And then, so were a lot of the other ANC members and people who were involved in the struggle. So they negotiated a settlement in terms of, transition from minority white rule to majority rule. And part of that negotiation was, everything was on the table: holidays, the Constitution, human rights, our Bill of Rights, education, job reservations, Group Areas Act, things that you wouldn't even think about, that were daily aspects of life for us. And one of the things was which holidays would be recognized, because we used to have days that only recognized white, days of significance to the white, to the whites. Like May 31st was what they called Republic Day. I'm trying to think of the days, I can't even remember them. In September there was a day called Fourth Record Day that recognized the Afrikaners, that came to South Africa and so on. So there was days like that. I think we had a Jan Smuts Day or something like that. So now they had to change these holidays because obviously we don't want to recognize those days. And the 2 days that were very, very prominent on the black calendar, if you will, or struggle calendar, whichever term you prefer, was June 16th and March 21st. June 16th was, obviously, I just told you the significance of that. March 21st was what we called, what was known as the Sharpeville Massacre. And we used to call it Sharpeville Day and Soweto Day. And I used to take those days off. I never used to fill in the leave form, when I worked in South Africa, because I used to say those were public holidays. So, when you're oppressed, when you in a situation that we were in South Africa, any act of defiance is will be acted out. Anything that you could do to defy the government, to defy the corporate structure, because it was a white structure, it was part of the government. So you do this. And one of the things was they knew these 2 days had so much of significance to us. So, personally, I take the day off. Not everybody was as fortunate as I who could afford to take the day off, but I just did, and I refused to fill in a leave form, so I wouldn't get paid for those days, which I thought was fine, because the idea of taking those days off just guiled the white man as such. It steamed them so much. So to me, I would have lost pay for the entire week just to take that one day off to upset these people because of the effect that it had on them. They knew how significant these 2 days were to us. So we call it Sharpeville Day and Soweto Day. And then they didn't like those terms because they were, there were days that I don't think they were embarrassed, but they just thought reflected badly on the white. So part of the negotiation and part of the reconciliation process was to rename those days. So 21st of March is called Heroes Day, and it's in recognition of all of the heroes of South Africa that were part of the struggle. And I didn't know this at the time, but I believe in South Africa, especially amongst in the US, especially amongst black people, you take your birthday off of work. Most people take their birthdays off. They don't go to work on their birthdays. Therefore, you file in the leave form. I didn't know this, but at the time, March 21st is also my birthday. So I should have used that as a good excuse, but that wouldn't have had an effect on them. So yeah, I think it had a bigger effect. But so these 2 days, that was part of the negotiation that we will, these 2 days will be on the public, be a public holiday, be recognized. But as I said, they're called Youth Day and they're called Soweto Day. South Africa also has one of the very, very few countries in the world that has a day in recognition of women. We have Women's Day. So that's recognizes women and the contribution and to the struggle and everything else. Because most of the men always got imprisoned. So the women, a lot of them were imprisoned as well, but more men were imprisoned and so on. So they continued the struggle. So it's in recognition of women. So it's a very, very modern and advanced constitution. Because it was the last constitution, basically, that was written.
So, were they able to make Afrikaans like the official language, or they dropped that?
Which period of time? 76 or?
Yeah.
Afrikaans was the official language. It was 2 official languages, Afrikaans and English. And the medium they taught in was English. Most of the black schools, and even a lot of white schools as well. But they wanted Afrikaans to be taught in the black schools because remember, it was all about control. Yeah. So, there's a slave owner from the West Indies, I think in 1940s, or maybe, 1800s, that wrote, we should not try to just control the slave by controlling them in their behavior. We should get into the minds. Because if we control the minds of the slave, we will control them for hundreds of years after slavery is abolished. So he knew that slavery was going to be abolished, but he said we've got to get into the minds of the slave. And if you think about it, there is still certain mindsets from the days of slavery that have not changed. So South Africa did the same thing. So part of the education process was to get their belief of us being inferior to whites in every possible way, through language, through curriculum, through everything. So if they start teaching you from the time you're 5, 6 years old when you go to school in this medium, then they'll be successful. So they were not successful in implementing it as the medium of instruction. They had to back off on that in 76. By the way, the same year, I don't know if you guys are familiar with, I know all of you have heard of Nelson Mandela. If you haven't, you just heard about him early on. But I don't know if you guys have heard of Stephen Biko. Stephen Biko was killed later that year. Stephen Biko was an icon of this struggle as well. In my opinion, he was more brilliant and more charismatic, and it's almost scared to say this, but more than Nelson Mandela was, in a sense. I think we would have reached freedom before if they did not kill him. They had to kill him. The man was too brilliant. And they killed him in jail. And go look it up. He died of natural causes. That's what they said. And his body was beaten up to twice its size. And the coroner's report was he died of natural causes. And we all agreed he died of natural causes. Because in South Africa, when you die at the hands of police, that's natural causes at the time. As a black person, anyway.
Do you think the efforts of reconciliation helped a little bit, or it just did? The efforts for reconciliation?
Yes. I think it definitely helped. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee was headed by Bishop Desmond Tutu. I think he visited Birmingham at some point. I don't remember exactly when. It brought closure to a lot of families who, whose sons and daughters had disappeared. And so we had, people who were it was their daily jobs to get rid of people, right? And kill them, and there was places where they attacked them in Swaziland, Lesotho, Botswana, and so on. They crossed the border, Mozambique, Angola, Tanzania, Nigeria. They went all the way up, and it was their jobs to infiltrate the African National Congress, attack and kill, the people who were fighting against them. So there was some closure that was brought. It did help. I would say that. But it didn't have the type of effect that I think Nelson Mandela and the people like him at the time hoped that it would have. Because black people are very forgiving. We had to. Because of the atrocities, if you look at it, throughout the world that was committed against us. And we had to forgive. Because we had no alternative. Because we still had to live in a world that is still controlled by the white man. Or the Western civilization, or Western way, or whatever you may want to call it. So there's no option that we have but to forgive. But unfortunately, there isn't reciprocity from the white side. I mean, if you look at Birmingham, right, as an example, forget South Africa, we are here in Birmingham. Look at the atrocities that was committed in Birmingham. And if you look at it today, there's a lot of white people who will tell you, that happened so long ago, I don't know why these black people are still talking about it. They should move on. They should pull up their bootstraps. They should get a job. They should get an education, because we gave them all of the opportunity. That's what you'd hear. You don't hear compassion. You don't hear forgiveness. You don't hear an apology for what was done. Well, it wasn't me. I wasn't even born then. That's what you would hear. That's the same thing that happens in South Africa. They say we are 22 years away from apartheid, so we should get over it and move on. That's the response you get from the other side. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Interesting.
I know that in Rwanda, it's been now 22 years
22
from
years.
the genocide, and the reconciliation was really big, and because you'd find that two people from different tribes that killed each other got married, and now the genocide happened after they were married. So reconciliation was really a big thing. The effect that it did, I know that there were some positives, but there's also some trauma that came from it. But in the long run, there were some decisions that were put out there for the public to try to do. And one of the things was to not identify yourself based on a particular tribe, because that's the theory that led to division. So one of the things that the younger generation does is that, like, when they ask you, like, what tribe do you belong to, you don't say anything, you just say, I'm Randi. So I was wondering, like, what would be some of the things that were put out there to just keep the reconciliation going, even for generations?
So the Truth and Reconciliation Committee or Commission that was headed by Bishop Tutu, part of reconciliation is finding out the truth, right? That's why it was called the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. So we found out the truth about what happened to thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, and what they did and so on. So it did a few things. One is it brought closure, as I said earlier on, to a lot of people. But it also inflamed a lot of, I don't want to say hate, but anger in people, because, you know, these people were allowed to walk. I mean, they killed not 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 people. They killed hundreds of people, like one individual, and they, as long as the what do you call it, rule or whatever it was, as long as you made full disclosure of what happened, then you would not be charged for it. So it inflamed a lot of anger when it did that, right? But people still got past that. And what happened in South Africa was there was a policy of divide and rule, like you said, about along tribal lines, right? So there's probably over 20 tribes in South Africa. Add to that my ancestry, which, you know, when you look at me, you think Indian, right? You're right. Because 5 generations ago, my ancestors came from India. But they were brought as slaves by the British. They didn't, you know, well, my ancestors anyway, there's some other people that came there because of business and everything else. They were brought as slaves. So they went in there and, you know, they worked in the cane fields and everything else. And if you look at, you know, slavery here, that was the history of Indians in South Africa. And so when I went to school, if you look at my high school or middle school picture, you'd say, yeah, he's Indian, he went to an Indian school. This must have been in Delhi or pick a place in India, right? Because everybody looked like that. And that was apartheid, because you were forced to live in these group areas. Likewise, they had people that were Zulu, people that were Xhosa, Ndebele, Sotho, and everything else. Everybody lived apart. And they created homelands, as they call them. And what they did was they gave some people more and some people less. And they did the same thing. They took the playbook out of the CIA, by the way, a lot of how to control people. So they divided them. Now we became a minority. Steve Biko was one who first started the Black Consciousness movement. And his argument was, as long as we see ourselves as Xhosa, Zulu, Indian, colored. They even had people of mixed race. They called them colored, and then they had tests that you had to perform to be into this race group, and people wanted to get into this race group that kind of gave them a little bit of an advantage, or gave them a little bit more, right? Because they give some more, some less, and so on, because that's how you get them fighting with each other. So they created all of these things, and that's how we lived. And so, but these were done in a very structured and destructive way on the psyche of people, to where they can think this way. And that's why I say to you, Stephen Biko was more brilliant and would have been more successful than Nelson Mandela. He saw through all of this as a very young man, very, very young man. He was a medical student in South Africa at the time. And he saw through all of this, and he started going out and talking to people. And he said, don't think of ourselves as Xhosa, Zulu, Indian, colored, whatever. Think of yourself as black and white. There's two races in this country. There's black and there's white. And as long as we think that, now we are in the majority. And that changed the dynamic in South Africa. It changed it in a very, very big way. So that happened in the 70s, in the early 70s. Unfortunately, they killed him. And so things started going backwards a little bit from that. But there's a large group of us who still, espouse those principles of Stephen Biko, and continue to live that way. But unfortunately, when you lose a leader that's that dynamic and start a movement that was that young, the ideology did not last through. And now you've got a case where you have a very small, you have we have a black government as such in South Africa, and you have people who were involved in the liberation movement now governing. And we're such a young democracy that, greed is a very human behavior, and it's creating a lot of problems. And now you've got people who have a lot and people who have nothing. So those old divisions are coming back. And we're going to have to, my prediction anyway, we're going to have another sea change in South Africa in terms of, now there's not just black and white, there's a much bigger segregation from people who have and people who don't have. And there's a small percentage of black people that have gotten very, very wealthy, and they don't want to give up their wealth. So it's creating this problem. And now you're going to have this economic disparity. And there's going to be a second revolution in South Africa that's going to change that. So you see the ugliness of, 30, 40 years ago, of where they tried to instill these differences, and people are now going back to those differences, unfortunately.
Along class lines.
Along, economic lines, class lines, tribal lines. It's amazing. You'll find that whenever you have destruction and tragedy, it brings out the best in humans, but it also brings out the worst in humans. We had the tornadoes. I was just talking to this young man about that early on. The big tornadoes that destroyed Birmingham, right, or large parts of Birmingham. And I saw the most amazing thing in being in the U.S. for all this time. People just came together and they wanted to help. They wanted to give, take water and food and all of those things. Amazing. And then you read that people were going and breaking into those homes that were abandoned and stealing from it. All right? You had the same thing with Katrina. So it brings out the best, but it also brings out the worst in mankind. So that's unfortunate, the case. And that's what's happening in South Africa at the moment. And we're going to have another discussion on reconciliation and how to make it work as a country. And we're going to have some honest discussions about what's going on.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm glad you discussed the whole your ancestry being from India originally and all of that, because I think like last year I was on Netflix and I like going to the foreign movies. So I was watching a movie called Lucky. And the boy, it was set in South Africa. The boy is from the village. His mother dies. So he goes to the city because his mom instructed him, if anything happens, you go to the city, you go to your uncle. So his uncle lives in like this apartment complex. On one side, it's, I guess, black, like African black people. I don't know how to differentiate indigenous African people. And then on the other side, like on the other side of the complex is Indian, South Africans. And I know that his uncle was just very terrible to this little boy. So he ran off, and he has a tape. His mother recorded a tape, and he really had to listen to it because that's the rest of his instructions for how to take care of himself, etc. He sees that in somebody's house, she has a tape player or whatever, and he wants to go in there and play it. But the person who owns the house is a very elderly Indian woman, Indian South African.
Right.
And I just remembered that when she saw him, she treated him so badly. I guess she was like, you black trash or whatever. You guys are always coming here bothering me, trying to steal from me. Why can't you leave me alone? Blah, blah, blah. Long story short, they obviously, they got to love each other and all that stuff, etc. And she ended up helping him out. It was just very interesting to me when I saw that she was trying to defend herself, and she was angry, but at the same time, she was scared, and it didn't look like it looked like she had full reason to be scared, because the movie also showed like downstairs, because she lived in like a few floors up, like downstairs there was a bunch of indigenous African children, and I think maybe I wasn't fully paying attention. I was just still shocked. I feel like those were the kids that she was always talking about, always picking on her, always bothering her, and things like that. So,
yeah. So the situation in South Africa is very complex, or was very complex. It still is. As I told you, my history, that it's 150 years old. So people, when they see me, obviously they think. They obviously think I'm sorry. I didn't even know you had come in. I didn't mean to turn my back to you. But they see me. They obviously think I'm Indian. We went there as slaves, right? And they went through all of the hardships and everything else. They got out of slavery, indenture, and so on. And then